Hello everyone. Today we're going to be covering the High Renaissance in Italy. You guys will not need to have any notes or any journal on this presentation, but you will need it for the final exam. So this is just a continuation of what we were unable to finish on Monday, April 9th. So we were talking about the Romanesque and the Gothic periods, and then we got into the early Renaissance, where you start to see some of the trends that become very accentuated in the High Renaissance. So the High Renaissance is the beginning of the 16th century, so the 1500s. It lasted for about 25 years, ending around 1520 CE. It noticed the continued appropriation of classical architecture, so you have Greek and Roman elements in painting and in sculpture, philosophy, science, etc. There's also the continued development of making art look believable. Utilizing the newly developed rules of perspective, artists would create highly illusionistic art. Artists would also strive to create forms and organize space in a way that corresponds with what and how we see reality, but also a way that occasionally prioritizes a desired visual and emotional aspect. Mainly, creating reality was the main point. There are also other trends such as the balance of the real and the ideal. So we'll continue to see the popularity of religious and mythological subject matter, in part because of the influence of Christianity in Europe, but also because the Catholic Church is one of the largest patrons for the art. The three great Italian artists that dominated this period are Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael. They are called the Triumvirate. Again, think back to our Etruscan lecture where the triumvirate was the rule by three. Giorgio Vasari is considered the father of art history. He wrote the lives of the most excellent painters, sculptors, and architects. He himself was an Italian artist and historian. He published his book in 1550, and this is known as the first art history book. Vasari uses the term Renaissance in his book, which emphasizes the intellectual ability required to make art, and he encouraged the view of artists as creative geniuses. So we will see the concept of the artist as an intellectual genius develop with Leonardo da Vinci, not just in the eyes of Vasari, but everyone in Italy as well as other parts of Western Europe. So Leonardo da Vinci is one of the great masters of the triumvirate. He literally embodies the term Renaissance man. Renaissance man, or this phrase, refers to somebody who knows a little bit about a lot of different things. Leonardo da Vinci is considered to have been the greatest genius who has ever lived. He was a painter, an inventor, sculptor, architect, engineer, scientist, and musician, and much more. Many of his works are actually uncompleted. He was known to not complete commissions. One famous case is the Mona Lisa, which was never delivered to its patron. For Da Vinci's early life, he was born to an illegitimate family. They were a wealthy Tuscan family. And very early on at 17, actually, this would have been considered late for the time of the Renaissance, he began his apprenticeship in Florence under Andrea del Verrocchio. Eventually, he worked for the Duke of Milan, Ludovico Sforza. Ludovico Sforza was the individual who commissioned The Last Supper, which is very famous artwork by Leonardo da Vinci. When Ludovico Sforza was imprisoned, Leonardo then went to the French monarchy and served as the royal court painter, and then died in May 2nd of 1519. Leonardo was a great thinker in the sense that he had a curiosity for many things and took very meticulous notes. In one of Leonardo's notebooks containing his anatomical studies is the drawing of an embryo in the womb. This is an early example of scientific illustration and the study of anatomy. In the Renaissance, it would not have been agrément to actually dissect a body. Dissection or an autopsy was seen as something that was either sacrilegious or a poor practice. He also made systematic studies of flying movements of birds and investigated the anatomy of the wing. He invented the aerial screw, which was one of the first prototypes for a helicopter. And he also studied general forms of movement in nature, and he understood that motion was the result of force and counterforce. So many people know him as this great painter, but he was also a great inventor. He also developed a technique called sfumato. Sfumato, meaning smoke in Latin, is considered or consists of layering translucent glazes to produce a hazy atmosphere, soft contours, and velvety shadows. So when we take a look at the figures of the Virgin Mary, Christ, and the scene that they're in here, we can see that kind of haziness and very soft attention to the modeling of the figures to give that three-dimensional quality. So normally, when you see Mary and Christ being represented in the early Renaissance, you have images of the Virgin and Child enthroned, as we see here on the right, in Giotto's Virgin and Christ in Majesty. So these are the type of typical representations you would have. However, Leonardo da Vinci has represented Mary seated on the ground. This type of representation of Mary is referred to as the Madonna of Humility. We immediately notice Mary's ideal beauty and the graceful way in which she moves, which features typical of the High Renaissance. This is actually the first time an Italian Renaissance artist has also completely abandoned halos. If you take a look at Giotto's image on the right, you can see that the Virgin Child, as well as all of the angels, have a golden halo surrounding the back of their heads. However, in Leonardo's vision, this is not the case. Leonardo found another way to indicate divinity. He gave the figures ideal beauty and grace. So the divine realm is something that is beyond the earthly. So idealizing these figures is hinting at the divine. We can also see that Leonardo grouped the figures together with the geometric shape of a pyramid. A pyramid instead of a triangle, because Leonardo is very concerned with creating an illusion of space, and the pyramid is three-dimensional, so we have the figures creating that sense of dimension for us, in addition to the atmospheric perspective. He also has the figures gesturing and looking at one another. So these innovations really serve to unify the composition and allows the viewer's eye to kind of move around the figures continuously. So starting on the right, you have the angel Gabriel, who is sitting with St. John the Baptist, the angel Gabriel is sitting with the Christ child, while the Virgin Mary is seated next to St. John the Baptist. Portraits might not seem unusual to us, but during the Renaissance, it was only the wealthiest bracket of society that could afford to have a copy of their likeness. Wealthy merchants would commission portraits, but typically would only have one painted during their lives. Portraits, therefore, spoke to social status. Before Leonardo, portraits were typically painted in the style that you see on the left. Mainly painted in profile, so only a side view, as well as being a bust portrait, so either from the shoulders or the head up, and they would often be posed in front of a landscape. The Mona Lisa is the most recognized painting in the world. The sitter is still unknown, but many scholars believe it is the portrait of the wife of a merchant in Florence named Lisa Gherardini. The painting was never delivered to the patron and was kept with Leonardo until his death. Now, what makes the Mona Lisa unique is that she is in a what we call 3/4 view. So rather than being in profile, she is almost completely turned to face us frontally. So she is directly addressing the viewer with this sense of engagement created by her eyes looking directly into ours. The hands as well are included. The hands often weren't included as they were very difficult to render. And there's also a smile, or at least a little hint of smile included. This is also a unique aspect as there were very little smiles in Renaissance portraits. Our next artist is Michelangelo. He was nicknamed Il Divino, meaning the Divine One. He was born to a minor noble family in Florence, and his kind of break actually comes when he meets his patron, Lorenzo de' Medici. Medici took Michelangelo under his wing, which allowed the artist to access the Medici collection, specifically of artworks from the Greco-Roman period as well as contemporary. And this included the premier artists of Florence from the early and the beginning of the High Renaissance. This included Donatello, again, as well as Greek and Roman statues. Michelangelo was a sculptor above all. He believed sculpting was the superior medium. Ironically, he actually did not like painting very much and refused at one point to paint the Sistine Chapel until he was essentially forced to. So this sculpture is hailed as one of his most famous creations. This is the Pietà. Pietà in Italian meaning pity, as the scene is meant to invoke the emotion of pity. So this particular object is located in St. Peter's Basilica. It presents a very intimate view of the Virgin mourning her dead son. So this kind of image of the Pietà, it was not a new one. If you take a look in the top right, the Röntgen Pietà is actually a German version of this same scene. So in the German version, we can see the forms are not idealized. You can see the ribs have been opened. There's blood spurting out. So this is meant to give a horrifying sense and evoke that sense of pity for this mother who has lost her son to save humanity. So Mary in Michelangelo, I want you to take a look at her face and how she's holding Christ in her lap. So Mary is depicted as very young and beautiful. Her lap is actually enlarged to hold up the weight of Christ's body. So this feels very natural looking, but for a woman to hold the body of a man this size, the proportions have been distorted. Now later on, when we get to the Mannerist and the Baroque period, or mainly the Mannerist and the late Renaissance, we'll see that the exaggeration of forms is very prominent, but they are very visible in the artworks, whereas here, Michelangelo has hidden them nicely. So let's consider how weight as well is suggested here. When we take a look at a couple of close-ups, we can see the visual weight of the body being created by the limp stature. So if you take a look at Mary's hand underneath the armpit of Christ's arm, you can see that she's pushing his muscles and his flesh upward as she's struggling to hold up his upper body. So there's this sense of flesh and of fabric, this emphasis on different textures, even though all of this is made through marble. So this creates dynamic compositions with the gentle curves in every aspect of the sculpture, from the folds of the drapery to the curls of the hair, the way that Christ's body lays upon the Virgin's lap. This seemingly silent moment is so packed full of emotion. But the way that Michelangelo represents it is something that is beyond human emotion, basically where the figures are so graceful and beautiful that they reach into that divine realm. Another famous artwork by Michelangelo is the David. It was originally created for the Duomo in Florence, or the major church, but was then repurposed to celebrate the removal of the tyranny of the Medici family, at least until Lorenzo would revive the dynasty in the 1520s. So this was placed in the Palazzo Vecchio, kind of the main center of Florence, so that everyone could see it. The symbolism of David, now if we remember David and Goliath, or the story of David and Goliath, David is a young boy who defeats this giant named Goliath, basically with a single slingshot, and cuts off the giant's head with his own sword. So this is a biblical narrative. And in the High Renaissance, we see that David is depicted as an older youth, so he's a younger man rather than being this young boy. And they do this so that he can have these kind of idealized proportions that are more reminiscent of Greek and Roman sculpture. So when we take a look at a comparison, so on the very left, you can see Donatello's version of the David. Now, this was also commissioned by the Medicis. Now, Donatello's version, we have a classical nude pose. You have the use of contrapposto. We have also arrived at the moment of defeat. So think about as well what moment in the story of David and Goliath is being depicted, as that's very, very important. So in the early Renaissance, you have more emphasis on the finished product, not just in reference to the artwork, but in the narrative. So David, the young boy, stands on top of Goliath's head and holds Goliath's sword that he just used to cut off Goliath's own head. So he's standing in this triumphant kind of pose. But when we look at Michelangelo's version in the High Renaissance, we can see that there is no head of Goliath present. So this tells us that the giant has not yet been slayed. So Michelangelo is holding the slingshot over his shoulder and is looking off into the distance with this kind of tense expression. So very indicative of the High Renaissance is this moment of quiet contemplation, kind of the calm before the storm. And if we look to the very right image, we can see the influence from the Greek and Roman past. If you compare both of Donatello and Michelangelo's sculptures to Polyclitus's Doryphorus, or the spear bearer, we can see how the use of contrapposto is being employed in these Italian Renaissance examples, as well as even the body positioning. So take a look at the left foot as it points backwards. All of the right arms are kind of laying in rest by the body, while the other arm, the left arm, is engaged in activity. Now, Michelangelo, in addition to being a painter and a sculptor, was a poet and an architect. He was actually the architect of the new St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican. But the Sistine Chapel is one of his most grand paintings. It was created shortly after his famous sculpture of the David and was commissioned by Pope Julius II. It is a fresco, mainly buon fresco, that depicts stories, prophets, and sibyls from the Bible's Old Testament. It took Michelangelo a painstaking 4 years to complete. The chapel itself is 128 feet long and 44 feet wide. So here's to show you exactly what is on each of the panels. You have 9 central panels in the center that depict the Old Testament story of Genesis. So that is from God dividing light from darkness all the way to Noah is drunk and disgraced. So Pope Julius actually required Michelangelo to cover the entire space with painted decoration focusing on religious themes. So I want you guys to think back to Giotto and the Arena Chapel, where you have those painted architectural elements and the use of trompe-l'oeil, and that's exactly what's being done here with Michelangelo. So this starts, or at least if you guys want to check out the Sistine Chapel virtually, I've included this URL for you guys. It actually links directly to the site. If you have a Flash plugin, it should be able to work. But you can actually navigate the space, and I'd like you guys just to take a look at some of the details. The ceiling was painted all by Michelangelo, as well as the top portion of the wall, but the lower portions were painted by other artists. So either way, it is still an absolutely massive achievement. The figures, or at least how Michelangelo had to arrange this composition in each section of the ceiling, was very important, as the images had to be clear to the viewers, since the viewers are about 70 feet below. So you had very detailed figure studies completed by Michelangelo, and each of the frames will typically only hold a maximum of 3 or 4 people. And this is not always the case, but you wanted fewer figures, or at least prominent figures, so that you could identify what's actually happening in the scene. So there's a reminiscence of the art of ancient Greece, where you have this idealism, emphasis on the youthful, nude male body. We can see that there's many nude men being emphasized here as being beautiful. The architecture as well is painted to look like stone lintels, cornices, and pedestals, and it really appears to come into our space versus the space of the narrative panels. So it gives us that sense that we are part of this painted scene. Michelangelo also created niches in the sides that portrayed Old Testament prophets and ancient Greek sibyls. A sibyl is a woman gifted with the ability of prophecy. So the creation of Adam is one of the most famous aspects of the Sistine Chapel. It represents the dynamic spark of life transferred from God to man. Now, this image has become iconic of the chapel ceiling images. In this central panel, we see very clearly the Renaissance idea that human nudity could be associated with the perfection of man as God's greatest creation. In addition to Adam and the figure of God, we also have the scene framed by 4 men, also known as ignudi. These are young, nude male youths that hold garlands and ribbons, and they support bronze shields. Now, they are merely meant for decoration and beautification of this ceiling. Around 20 years after completing the ceiling, Michelangelo was commissioned by Pope Clement VII to return to the Sistine Chapel. So the wall behind the altar, this is still the place where the Eucharist is performed. So you have the blood and the body of Christ represented by the bread and the wine. So this is also where the Pope would have given Mass, and where the College of Cardinals select the next Pope even to this day at the Sistine Chapel. So 20 years later, Michelangelo is commissioned to paint the scene of the Last Judgment at the altar. We already discussed the commonality of having the scene of the Last Judgment at the altar, or the space within the altar, when we talked about the Arena Chapel from Giotto. So surrounding Christ, we have saints and Old Testament figures, but this scene is also divided between the the blessed on the right and the damned on the left. Christ looks toward the damned and seems to point directly at his wounds, as if saying, "This is basically what you get for what you did to me." So he's presented as a very powerful figure at the moment of the Last Judgment. We see the blessed actually rising up from their graves, and they are being pulled up by angels. One couple is even pulled up by a rosary. If you take a look to the middle right, you can see the couple that's hanging on by that rosary. And there is a physical weight that's being employed. So they are still humanly bodies, they are heavy, and this is the wonderful thing about Michelangelo, is that he's not just depicting people kind of floating into heaven effortlessly, but even if you are saved, he's giving us the message that you still have to struggle to prove that you are worth entry into heaven. On the opposite side, we see the damned. They have been taken to hell by the boatman Charon. So there's a hint of Christian and religious themes, but also paganism. So this mirrors the angels on the right side of Christ. Ooh, let me go back here. So you have the angels who are blowing the horn on the blessed side, as well as the angels pulling up. But oppositely, we see the damned being pulled down to hell by these demons. So we can see that the demons have horns. Their bodies are still idealized, but their faces are distorted and exaggerated. Likewise, angels can be seen punching the damned back down to hell. So these people on the opposite side are struggling to get up into heaven. We can see that many of these figures are holding on to the legs of someone else or trying to hold on to a cloud while demons are pulling them back down to hell. So there is a real sense of the physical struggle. Michelangelo is characteristically focusing on the physical weight of the body. But in addition to the physical, we see an intense amount of emotion here as well. The figure to the left is one of the damned being pulled down by a small horned devil. So the devil wraps around his legs, his hand comes up to cover his eye, possibly in disbelief, but he opens one eye in realization of what's happening. So Michelangelo has moved past the classical representation of the body and is now distorting it in this image. So we see a difference from the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, which he completed during the High Renaissance, and then we see how he is exaggerating certain forms in the Last Judgment 20 years later. Now, the body has symbolic value, and the body itself and how it's positioned and represented serves to deliver that emotional message. The image of St. Bartholomew is one of the most notable figures. He actually holds a knife in one hand and his own skin in another. He was martyred by being flayed alive, but when we look to the face of the flayed skin, we can see that it is actually a portrait of the artist. So here is St. Bartholomew to the left of Christ, and you can see that he's holding his own skin. And when we compare this to a portrait of Michelangelo, we can see the similarities. Now, St. Bartholomew was one of the 12 disciples of Jesus. He preached in India and Armenia, where he was martyred. He was skinned alive and then crucified upside down for refusing to worship pagan gods. So the face is essentially a self-portrait by Michelangelo. So there's a couple of possible meanings that scholars attribute as to why he might represent himself in this way. Michelangelo was a very tortured artist. He had a very brooding and isolated personality. So this is possibly a visual concern for the fate of his own soul. It could also be an indication of his dissatisfaction with painted commissions, as his favorite process was sculpting. Or it may also refer to the artist's struggle with homosexuality. Baggio di Cascina was a papal master of ceremonies, so he was a member of the church, and he actually criticized Michelangelo's work, saying that nude figures had no place in such a sacred place, and that the paintings would be more at home in a public tavern. So Michelangelo, as a response, included da Cascina in the Last Judgment as the figure of Minos. Minos was one of the 3 judges of the underworld. He also gave him the ears of an ass, and also take a look at this giant snake that is wrapping around Minos' body and where the snake's head is biting. When de Cascina complained to the Pope basically explained that he had no jurisdiction over hell and that the portrait would have to remain. So, unfortunately for de Cascina, his criticism of Michelangelo resulted in his image being flaunted quite unflatteringly for as long as the Sistine Chapel stands. This image is a very famous one from the Sistine Chapel. This is the Libyan Sibyl. So Sibyls had prophetic powers, and I want to highlight here, so the finished product is on the right, the drawing is on the left. So I want you to notice the repetition of body parts. See how Michelangelo is trying to figure out how all of the parts come together as a whole, even to the point of how the toe should look. If you take a look at the right bottom side of the red chalk drawing, you can see the toe represented 3 different times until he finally finds a position that he likes. He first began on the other side of the paper with gray-colored chalk, but then moves to the other side to produce more refined images. So we can actually see the spots he marks that will give the greatest highlight and shadow. So if you're taking a close look at the image, you can see these lines that are coming off of the shoulders, as well as the ribs. And this is indicating where those lights and shadows are located. He even inscribes the number 3 to indicate that 3 ribs that protrude from that part of the body. So you can really sense the sculptural way of drawing and painting that Michelangelo did. It almost feels like a relief sculpture in the sense that parts are actually protruding from the page. So Michelangelo's work can be characterized as being very 3-dimensional. So Raphael is our last member of the triumvirate. He was the youngest of the 3, Leonardo being the oldest, Michelangelo in the middle. Raphael arrived in Florence in 1504, where he remained until 1508. Now, these years were very important for his artistic development. He originally trained with his father, who was the main painter for the Urbino court, and when he arrived in Florence, he was immediately struck by the works of Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo. He would also receive grand commissions like the Vatican Stanza room, rooms in the Pope's apartment, from Pope Julius II, the one who also commissioned the Sistine Chapel. But unfortunately, Raphael would die at a young age in 1520. Now, Raphael's work is very characteristic of the high Renaissance, kind of at its peak, after the innovations done by Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo. So this is the School of Athens. This fresco was paid for by the Catholic Church via Pope Julius II. And what's interesting here is that Raphael was actually painting this at the same time that Michelangelo was painting the Sistine Chapel just down the street. Now, the School of Athens is located in the private library of Pope Julius II. Pope Julius II was a major patron of the arts during the Renaissance. He spent a campaign to restore Rome and the Vatican back to its classical grandeur. And the design was integral to not only make the figures appear naturalistic and give that illusionistic sense of space, but also to, as propaganda, to represent certain humanist ideals. So it's located in a library. Now think about what a library is. It's an environment for learning. And there's actually a series of 4 frescoes, including the School of Athens. And these contain representations of the 4 branches of human knowledge. So what we see here, the scene that we have going on, you have the use of actually not just 1-point perspective, but 2-point perspective. And you have 2 great philosophers from antiquity surrounded by other great thinkers. So here we have the branch of philosophy, the physical world, and the sciences. Other panels in the library include theology, poetry, and justice. All 4 are meant to be seen together in this singular room. So if you look at the center of the composition, we can see 2 figures, one of Plato, the other Aristotle. So Plato is older, he's Aristotle's teacher. We see him holding a book and pointing upward to the realm of pure ideas that Plato thought was more true than the everyday world. And Aristotle was Plato's student, and he's holding his book of ethics. He focused on the physical, observable realm, which can be seen by his palm pointing downward. He's also wearing colors of earth and water. So now these 2 form the intellectual division between philosophers. So Plato's side are philosophers concerned with the issues of the ideal and higher truths of pure logic. One example you guys might be familiar with is Pythagoras, who discovered the laws of harmony in music and mathematics. So he is represented on Plato's side. On Aristotle's side, you have philosophers interested in the physical laws of nature and observable truths. For example, Euclid, who was interested in measure and the practical, and is known as the father of geometry. So the all-over kind of general message is that sharing knowledge, accumulation of learning, and a reflection of inner wisdom are all very virtuous attributes. There's no names to actually identify the figures, but we can identify them based on the objects that they carry with them, as well as their movements and demeanor. The free movement of the figures is also indicative of the free exchange of ideas in a university and centers for learning. Now, this concept comes from ancient traditions of the Greeks, but architecturally, we're actually recalling the innovations of the Romans with the use of the barrel vault. You also have, in addition to a message of learning and sharing of knowledge, you have hidden portraits of the triumvirate. In the foreground, the modern philosopher Heraclitus is depicted being lost in his own thoughts, so we can see him in the bottom left. He's writing on a block of marble, and this is actually modeled after the sculptor Michelangelo, often again described as isolated and brooding. The figure of Plato actually is represented by the portrait of Leonardo da Vinci, so kind of the father or the initiator of everything. When we take a look, you actually see Raphael on the right. In the composition, if you look in the center where Plato and Aristotle's feet are and take a line directly to the right, you can see Raphael's head poking out from behind this group talking. Now, papal portraiture is very significant. So Raphael would complete many portraits of the Pope. This is a portrait of Pope Julius II. Pope Julius II, you guys can take a look at this this link here to Khan Academy. It talks about some of the attributes of Raphael's portrait of Pope Julius II, specifically the use of oil paint starting to become more popular in the Italian Renaissance. So you get that attention to these rich textures. We'll be seeing the influence from the Northern Renaissance of the use of oil paint come through very quickly. Raphael is also using portraits of the Pope to comment on the corruption of the clergy. So Pope Leo X was actually the son of Lorenzo de' Medici. He was known for having wasteful habits and enjoying the earthly pleasures of being Pope just a bit too much, and his actions would actually directly lead to the Protestant Reformation. So Leo is actually represented with his two illegitimate relatives. You have Giulio de' Medici and Cardinal Luigi de' Rossi. So this shows that prominent families like the Medicis generally maintain the control or the highest positions in society. We also see that the canvas is dominated by the color red, which was the color chosen to represent the Pope. Both of the men, Luigi and Giulio, are very close to the Pope as seen by their positions. Giulio looks at the Pope and Luigi looks at us as if we had just entered the room, but he keeps his hands on the Pope's chair. When we look at the Pope, we can see that he has in front of him what is known as the Hamilton Bible. It is identified as the image as Leo studies it with a magnifying glass. The Hamilton Bible was actually owned by his father, Lorenzo, so this again reinforces the Medici's lineage and prestige. About this time, or just before Raphael's death, you have paintings that are commenting on the injustices of the church. So this directly influences the Protestant Reformation. In 1517, Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses condemning abuses of the church. These abuses included the selling of indulgences, which Leo had used to fund the construction of St. Peter's Basilica. Now, indulgences are grants by the Pope that reduce your time in purgatory that you would have to serve to absolve your sins. Now, typically, this is achieved through confession, prayer, and spiritual meditation, as Martin Luther thought it should be, but Leo started the practice of selling them, so exchanging monetary value. So for next time, we will be discussing the late Renaissance, as well as the Northern Renaissance and Mannerist traditions. So as we're talking about some of these trends that are starting to be developed and codified in the High Renaissance, take note of how those trends will change in the late Renaissance.